Hi, this is Hannah, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. What factors hindered Tunisia's democratic transition after the Arab Spring? In this episode, we speak with Professor Daniel Brumberg, a professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University and co-founder of its Democracy and Governance Master's Program. We discuss Tunisia's political landscape and how polarization impacted its own democratic journey. We also discuss theories of political transition, Middle Eastern development politics, and Dr. Brumberg's perspectives on Iran.
Hi, I'm Joshilyn Binkley. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy.
Hi, my name is Hannah Balikci. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm also a Pearson Fellow. So let's get right into it. Professor Brumberg, could you please introduce yourself and your work?
Good morning. My name is Dan Brumberg. I am a professor of comparative politics at Georgetown University, one of the co-founders of our MA program in democracy and governance studies, which we began some 15 years ago. And now I'm a senior advisor of that program, and I'm still teaching at Georgetown. I have been working on issues of comparative political change in the Middle East and the broader developing world for a long time. That's my broad focus.
How did you find yourself studying the Middle East specifically? How did your interests change?
Well, without giving your audience all the gory details, they go back far to when I was an undergraduate at Indiana University, and I was very much involved in Jewish student politics. I found myself repeating slogans that I didn't necessarily completely believe in, particularly when it came to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and got interested in standing back and thinking about that conflict from an academic and analytical perspective as opposed to an advocacy perspective. And I was working with a professor at that time, Lebanese professor, the late Ilya Harik, and I wrote a thesis, an honors thesis on U.S. policy on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and that really is the start of trying to think about the world of the Middle East through the lens of an analyst who's trying to be as objective as possible under often difficult circumstances. Ilya Harik had gotten his PhD at the University of Chicago, and he and other people encouraged me to apply, and I came and I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, focusing at the time on the politics of political resistance and opposition under the presidency of the late Anwar Sadat in Egypt, but also as a result, somewhat fortuitous, of meeting the late Marvin Zonis, who taught in the Department of Behavioral Sciences. I started working on Iran as well, so I've had a twin focus, which is, I suppose, a little unusual for folks in my field, on both the Arab world and Iran, although I lived in Egypt for 2.5 years and learned Egyptian Arabic and wrote my dissertation on Egypt. Iran was and remains a special interest of mine, kind of a passion.
Wow, all these decades later, and those are still incredibly relevant states to be looking at. So you gave a talk yesterday on Tunisia's polarization in the region of turmoil, and you said the Tunisian uprising is commonly referred to as a revolution, but it was actually more of a revolt. Could you talk more about the history of that uprising and what makes it a revolution, or not a revolution, considering the context?
Well, whether it's a revolution or not depends on how you define the word revolution. So from my perspective, a revolution is a popular uprising that removes and topples the social and political structure and replaces it with a different social and political structure. In that sense, the last great revolution in the Middle East was the Islamic Revolution in 1979. For all kinds of reasons that are hotly debated among scholars, I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been much of a kind of revolutionary change in the Arab world. There have been evolutions, there have been key moments, there have been rebellions, but the typical process has been to absorb institutions from the previous regime into the new regime, and therefore, even under the label of revolutionary change, there has been a great deal of continuity in terms of the previous structures that are absorbed into the new ones, and Nasser's Egypt is a great example of that. What interested me about Tunisia was that the popular uprising of 2011, which really did portend a possible revolution, ended up with something much more familiar for students of comparative politics, and that is a political agreement, an arrangement, a pact, or lots of names, a power-sharing pact, in which elements of the previous regime negotiated with new social forces, and new social forces that had very different perspectives negotiated among themselves, and they came up with an agreement in 2014, which was translated into the new constitution, which was a power-sharing arrangement, which meant that you accommodated rather than overcame the previous parts of the regime that were part of the authoritarian regime, and they were accommodated in ways which were democratic but not revolutionary. So I hope that answers your question, and there's no shame in saying that democratic change that often is revolutionary is exclusive. There are winners and losers, and some actors are cast out of the system. That's not a democracy when you cast out certain actors. So in many respects, the political pact negotiated in Tunisia in 2014 was very much apart with the other forms of transition politics we are familiar with in the developing world.
Could you give a quick background for our audience on the current players in the Tunisian political sphere and their allegiances or platforms? For example, I know the Ennahda movement is the Islamist party, correct? What are the other what other party is its biggest political player?
Well, that's a great question. There's no other party that remains as influential as Ennahda, but Ennahda doesn't carry the kind of influence it used to have, in part because of the coup d'etat effectively in 2021 by the current president, Kais Saied, but also as a result of the disillusionment of many young people with the political system. It's fair to say that starting in 2014, 15, 16, Ennahda was the largest single, most effective political party. It faced a number of secular parties, quasi-secular. Nida Tunis, the Call of Tunis, was the most prominent one. But in terms of the capacity for mobilization, none of these other quasi-secular parties could possibly replicate Ennahda's capacity for political mobilization, now greatly undermined not only by the coup, but by the fact that Ghannouchi, the head of Ennahda, is sitting in prison with almost every prominent political opponent of the regime as well. In separate cells, I might add, but they're all in prison.
Yeah, I think kind of going through Kais Saied's rise to power, would you be able to give a background on that and how he sort of got to the position he's in now?
Well, the story is going to be familiar to those who are listening to this podcast if we're familiar with the kind of dynamics that lead to disillusionment with democracy and the context in which political paralysis among a political elite leads to alienation with estrangement from the dominant political class. And the rise of a populist leader should be a familiar story to Americans, who poses as this kind of a savior, right? Make America great again, make Tunisia great again, make Hungary great again, make Brazil great again. It's a familiar, unfortunate story. And that's very much part of what happened in Tunisia. What led up to the effective coup of the current president was that the power sharing between Islamists and secularists was a recipe for political paralysis and economic paralysis. And the more this paralysis set in, the more average Tunisians looked at what was going on in Tunis and said, this is just not a politics that's relevant to my life or relevant to my daily struggles. And it was that sense of disillusionment that brought Kais to the presidency. He was elected in 2019 legitimately, in a legitimate election. But by then, all the other political leaders had basically lost support, including Ghannouchi. And so Kais Saied was able to manipulate and leverage this estrangement to put himself in a position where, starting in 2021-22, he basically began to take apart the entire institutional and legal edifice of liberal democratic governance, far from perfect, that was established in 2014.
Could you speak a little bit more to that paralysis that we saw in the years leading up to his election?
Well, power sharing is this weird thing, right? The basic idea of power sharing is each side fears that the other side will exclude it. The fear of the Islamists was justified in 87. They didn't win an election, but in 87, 88, I can't remember which year now precisely. There were parliamentary elections, and they had the largest share of the vote. And then President Ben Ali closed them down, hunted down their leaders, put them in prison, tortured them for years. And so when the transition took place in Tunisia in 2011, starting in 2011, the leadership of Ennahda understood that if they were going to sustain their participation in the new political game, they had to make guarantees to the secularists that they wouldn't abuse their power, because it was precisely the fear of secularists that the Islamists would use the vote to deprive secular leaders of their rights that, in fact, led to the kind of implicit support that the secularists had given autocracy prior to the transition, right? If you think about autocracy, it's a kind of protection racket. Think Don Corleone. Think The Godfather. You give certain groups protection, and you create or you manipulate the perception of enemies on the other side. Now, in this sense, it wasn't simply manipulated. There are significant existential differences between Islamists and secularists. Those differences are not as deep as, let's say, ethnic differences. We don't have a Kurdish minority, for example, in that sense, or a Berber minority. But it's an ideological difference that is as strong in that society as it is in the United States. Think about how deep it is in this country and the consequences for our democracy. So that's what happened. And the fear that of Islamists that they would be excluded was mirrored by the fear of secular groups that the Islamists would take power and exclude them. So the bargain reached in 2014 created guarantees, including in the electoral system, so neither group could have a majority of the seats and use its majority to impose its will on the other. But this led to paralysis because all the guarantees that were necessary for the transition also blocked further consolidation on key issues: economic reform, the role of the market, the nature of religion and the state, the nature of the judiciary, and probably most of all, security sector reform. What do you do with the security apparatus? What do you do with the military? So the irony and the paradox in Tunisia is what was necessary for the transition has effectively helped to undermine consolidation. And that's a Gordian knot that no leader was able to untie or are willing to untie.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you talked about this yesterday as well, where there was a first transition, the 2011 uprising, and the pact that was made in 2014 kind of came in as this blockage of the secondary transition. Could you go into a bit about how external powers play a role in the polarizing of these identities between the Islamists and the secularists, and how that related to maybe the current situation in Tunisia?
Yeah, and it's an essential question, particularly in a country of Tunisia, like Tunisia, 11 million people, squeezed between Libya and Algeria, in a very contentious region of the world. And power sharing arrangements, by definition, usually are accompanied by weak states. And that was the case in Tunisia, a weak state. So we had intervention in the Tunisian power sharing arrangement from the very beginning. The United Arab Emirates and the Saudis in particular tried to support secular groups. Particularly the United Arab Emirates is very active in its opposition to Islamist political groups and parties. Very suspicious of democracy to begin with. But the same became true under Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So those two states supported secular parties in effect, or tried to. And Qatar and Turkey supported or implicitly supported, and there's a great deal of controversy about how this support evolved. We don't know a lot of the answers, by the way. But Turkey and Qatar were involved in supporting the political parties from the beginning. And then in the context of the so-called Arab Spring of 2012, 13, 14, and the collapse of governance in Libya, a civil war emerged with multiple forces. The government that emerged there was eventually one that had or included some Islamist voices within it. And that meant, of course, that the struggle between Qatar and Turkey on the one hand, this is highly simplifying a complex issue, but the struggle between those two states and on the other side, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, to affect events not only unfolded in Tunisia but in Libya, where there was no state and there was essentially a civil war. So all of these pressures translated into not only pressure and activity and sort of interventions in the Tunisian case, but also magnified the struggle between secular groups and Islamists. Again, secular is a very bad term for a complex reality, but we'll leave it at that. Those interventions heightened the fears of each group that they had outside allies that they would use to exclude their opponents. So nothing good came out of these interventions or the role of these particular outside parties.
Thank you. I think it's interesting, as I myself am Turkish American, so I find that the Turkish situation is interesting to look at how it plays a factor into other roles, especially looking at its own history. I'm taking a class currently on the early Turkish Republic, so how it sort of built the Turkish state kind of seems similar to how Tunisia itself was trying to build its state. You talked yesterday again about how Tunisia's constitution made it a Islamic, or like a country with Islamic values, but with a civil government. How does that relate, or how does that fit into that clash between the parties, or was that one of those compromises that you talked about where there was a secular civil government but with Islamic values?
The wording of the Constitution itself was negotiated precisely along the lines that you're alluding to, kind of, particularly in Article 1, a formula which recognized the religious roots of Tunisian society, but defined the government as civil or civic. The word secularism in the United States is often misunderstood in the Middle East, and it's conflated with laïcité in French, which means a government that excludes religion. In our country, the government protects your right to religious values and religious beliefs. We depend on the state to enhance religion by virtue of the fact that state and mosque, or state and church, or state and synagogue are separate. Mm-hmm. The separation of those two institutions in the United States provides the basis for religious freedom, not the opposite. The French version is the opposite, right? Mm. So there's lots of concerns in the Arab world about the possibility of laïcité as opposed to American-style secularism. I'm saying this because the compromise in the case of Tunisia was closer to what we think about in the United States. People are free to worship or not worship, believe or not believe. But it left enough ambiguity such that more hardline Islamists felt that, that was a backdoor to advancing their interests. And secular groups felt secure, but also feared that some of this wording, which was intentionally ambiguous, would lead to their Islamist allies coming back to the fray. So it was always a kind of, I describe it always as a kind of ideological ceasefire. Very different from Turkey. Erdogan and the AK party is an Islamist party. And they're much more explicit in that than the Ennahda was. And when Erdogan visited Tunisia after the revolution or the uprising, he praised Ennahda as if it was a representative of or allied with or a version of Turkish Islamist politics. And it's not.
Right.
It's not. It's different. And Ghannouchi at the time, because he wasn't in prison, kind of chastised him. He said, this is not what we're doing here. But the ambiguity of the formula raised and agreed to by the various parties in Tunisia always left the door open to further conflict.
Thinking a little bit about what you were saying about power sharing pacts and that they tend to be among weak states, then when a president like Sayed, who was voted in a legitimate election, won 73% of the vote, when that's kind of the framework that Tunisia is coming from, if there's still this kind of accommodation, this kind of power sharing that they're transitioning from, do you think it was inevitable that there was this kind of shift towards a more authoritarian regime?
Well, it's always the $64 million question. Maybe not inevitable, but the kind of paralysis that was at the heart of the power-sharing arrangement really limited the readiness of political leaders to take risks, particularly on the issue of market reform. So the economic reform program that needed to be advanced, this wasn't a leftist regime under the previous regime under Ben Ali, but it was one that was highly involved in managing the economy in a very corrupt way. That had to be undone. They needed a state that wasn't captured by economic interests, but would play the role of a kind of moderator, as the case is in capitalist states. But it was a captured state. There was a lot to be done, but it wasn't done because there's a collective action problem. We all know what we need to do. Let the other guy do it. Let the other party take a risk. If every party assumes that the other side is going to have to take the risk, there is no risk taking. Everybody pays a high price. That's what happened. So maybe it wasn't inevitable. The political leaders really lost sight of what they were doing. They got wrapped up in their own petty family and ideological disputes. A lot of these disputes, by the way, were about family and personal matters. They weren't always about ideology, sometimes more so than ideology. Not easy to separate out those things, but they got mixed up. And so in so many arenas, there was a failure of policy making and a failure to do the kinds of things that needed to be done, or if they were done, in the case of economic market reforms, they weren't really implemented. Decisions took place, but there was no implementation. There was a creation of local government, but the institutional apparatus of local government and the laws were confusing and onerous, and it really wasn't translated into policy. So there was paralysis. Maybe not inevitable, but likely, and the longer it lasted, the worse it got, right? The logic of not moving was kind of institutionalized. So, it's kind of a Greek tragedy. You stand there watching it. The chorus is singing. The characters all crying because they know their fate and they would rather not have it, but they have to submit to it. Speaking of Greek tragedies. So
I think that kind of goes into one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is the theory of political transitions, or Acemoglu Robinson model, although, again, as Turkish, Acemoglu Robinson model that you Chicago students, actually Harris students specifically, learn in a class called Analytical Politics. I think this relates to the idea of having this rich elite and the common people, and how the cost of insurrection or the cost of revolt has to be low enough to allow for revolution and have this change of an autocracy to a democracy. Do you find that the situation in Tunisia was this elite had an unequal control of capital, and that that market reform you're talking about was such that it was never redistributed to the people? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, it was not only not redistributed to the people, the elite was not monolithic. And there were cronies. This was crony capitalism under the previous regime. It really dominated the economy in very obvious ways. You could see it in terms of who had hotels and businesses, who didn't. You had to take a whole apparatus of investment law that was really built around that system and change it. And there were enormous forces within the old regime, mafias, essentially, powerful mafias that resisted that change. So you had resistance from the mafias, and then you had resistance from the UGT, the trade union, 800,000 strong, out of 11 million people. And they didn't want any market reforms that imposed any costs on their members. So these twin forces, from sort of the left and the right, to put it simplistically, really sort of paralyzed the ability of an elite that was already split. And that's why these models of elite versus masses don't really work, right? They really do not work. And the other thing about transition theory that often doesn't work is that, and Jaworski and others would certainly agree with this, the kind of founders of the transition theory, as I understand it, really thought about transitions in terms of Latin America. But the issue in Latin America was not the role of the church and the state. It wasn't an existential issue. Nobody was trying to figure out in Argentina, even in Brazil, where the state is very powerful and where the church is very powerful, really what it meant to be an Argentine or what it meant to be a Brazilian. But in many states, if not every state of the Middle East, and that includes Israel as well, the question of ultimately what the state represents in terms of citizenship and values and identity has never been fully resolved. Everybody thought it was resolved in the case of Tunisia because it's a homogeneous country in many respects. It has a small Jewish minority, very small. No Christian minority, no real ethnic groups, although there are Berbers, but they're not. The Berbers are not strong like they are in Morocco or certainly Algeria. So this country, they have the prerequisites for democracy, but it turns out the ideological fissures between Islamists and secularists, and also within those groups, were very potent. So the models we have for classic transition theories, if they don't take into account those additional factors, they usually don't work very well.
Got it. I think this might be a good way to transition to Iran and talking about that political not just that political transition, but your work there.
Yeah, I would just be interested, we're talking about, states' abilities to transition, to, maintain democracy, to change their institutions. And even in a case like Tunisia, where it would make sense that they would be able to have democracy, I wonder, how does a big player like Iran limit states and, people's abilities to create the society and the institutions that they want if it's, maybe going against something that would be in the interest of a state like Iran?
Well, Iran, boy, it's a hard nut to crack analytically. It is, as I said at the outset of our discussion, the only state in the region that had a social revolution and an almost complete turnover of the previous social and ideological order, that of the Shah, which was overturned and replaced by a charismatic leader named Khomeini. And when I was a graduate student at University of Chicago working with the late and great Marvin Zonis, he had a trove of speeches translated from Khomeini. In fact, almost every speech was available in a public source to the American audience, in fact, the world audience. And I read them and said, oh, this is interesting. What was interesting about it was that Khomeini didn't seem to have a clear sense of a coherent ideological project. It wasn't what I fully expected from a fundamentalist, whatever that means. And then when I realized that there was something there to look at and I started reading more and more, I began to realize that Iran was what I call a dissonant state in which different ideological projects have been pinned together, which is a very familiar process in developing states. It's not unique. And it was precisely those different projects and the way they were institutionalized that in 1997 opened the door to the reformists and the late president, not the late president, he's not gone yet, thank God, but President Khatami, then President Khatami, who opened up the whole process of political reform. And that's what really interested me, and that's what got me involved in writing a book called Reinventing Khomeini, The Struggle for Reform in Iran. And during the most optimistic period of Khatami's rule as president, I visited Iran 3 times, 2 or 3, I can't remember now, and did a certain amount of field research, interviewing reformists and what I call leftist Islamists about their politics. I had been invited to a conference to talk about my book on Khomeini. And that was a great moment because doing field work for American researchers can be a fatal attraction. I haven't been back since then, and I can't go back. It's completely, it's extremely dangerous for an American academic, and for an American Jewish academic, even more so. I mean, the highest risk is for Iranian Americans because they get arrested when they go back, and the friends and colleagues of mine have gone through that already. But I will not and cannot go back, which is a great shame.
When did you conduct your field research there?
2001.
Wow.
The heyday of Khatami's. It was a period of great optimism. The reformists felt they were riding a wave. They kept defending their agenda by using Khomeini's own language, which was very clever. And everybody did that, of course. But what happened is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which is the security apparatus, has very deep roots. And as soon as Khatami got going, the IRGC began to shut it all down. And they've been doing that ever since. Because for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, their job is to maintain the revolution. And the deeper their ideological and economic roots, the more they have to defend. So it's very difficult to move beyond the barriers they have placed towards political reform. And every protest movement, including the women's protest movement over the last year, has clashed with that reality. Honestly, I never thought that protest movement, which created a lot of optimism starting more or less a year ago, would go very far because the stakes are so high. To have a transition means that all the political parties have to assume that they're not signing their death warrant, that they can go through a transition and survive. From the point of view of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, there's no thing like a little transition. It's like being a little pregnant. You know, start going down that path and you're going to have the democratic baby. So you're not going to do it. So there's no room for a political pact because when the issues are so deeply existential, but at the same time you have a power apparatus like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, it's not willing to take any risks. The good thing about Tunisia was that there was no politicized military. And the security apparatus, although very strong under Ben Ali, fell apart as soon as his regime collapsed and he took off to Saudi Arabia. So the Tunisians benefited from what I call the happy fact that to have a transition, they either fight among themselves or they negotiate. Because there's no third party that they can run to for cover. There's nowhere to go. In the case of Iran, it's not only the IRGC, but not an insignificant part of the population. It's a minority, but it's a powerful one, that wants that protection from that protector. So there's a powerful barrier to political change, and that's exacerbated by the conflict between Iran and the United States, about which I've done a lot of work on the nuclear issues, on deterrence. I've written a lot. I've participated in Denmark in second-track diplomacy meetings over a period of a few years with Iranian leaders. I'm not trying to talk about my experience in that regard. That's what I'm really getting at is that this conflict for the Iranian hardliners is absolutely essential to their survival. Without that conflict, they really don't have one major foundation of the revolutionary apparatus to hang on to. So they don't want to have normalization. And they were always suspicious of an agreement on nuclear issues as well.
I find that so interesting because one of the Pearson Institute, I'm a Pearson Fellow, and one of the things you have to do to apply for that is talk about a conflict in the world that you don't understand or you can't find a resolution to. And I chose the U.S.-Iranian conflict mostly because I don't really see a path forward. And the way that you're talking about this is that it's not even, I mean, both sides aside, at least the Islamic Revolutionary Guard uses the strained U.S. relationship as a way to maintain power. Do you think there's any path forward, like given that idea and that usage of this relationship? Is there a path forward on like ever normalizing relationships normalizing the relationship between the United States and Iran, or is it always going to be this continued tension?
We have to take apart what we mean by normalization. If we mean the equivalent of the Abraham Accords between, let's say, the United Arab Emirates and Israel, the answer is no.
Right.
It's not going to happen. An agreement on the JCPOA, the joint agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, provided probably the only useful step that might have created a small degree of progress. That was removed by Trump in what I think is the most catastrophic diplomatic decision of the United States, far worse than, I think, the invasion of Iraq. The decision basically to repudiate that agreement has placed these two countries back on a kind of potential conflict path. But because for the hardliners there's so much at stake, much more at stake there than here, it's not a symmetrical problem. They really are anything that looks like a major path forward. Now, when the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, finally passes away, and he will eventually, and there's a new leader, that leader will have a lot of room, or some room, to reconsider some of these issues. But my sense is that the regime is preparing the groundwork now for a new leader who will carry on Khamenei's legacy, and there won't be much room. What we'd also have to see is a return of the reformists to the political arena in a substantial way. What I don't think a path to reform is revolution. I don't think that a U.S. military attack on Iran's nuclear sites would open the door to democracy. It would only harden the regime and or open the door to internal strife. So the opportunities for elements of normalization can't be excluded. But given the circumstances right now and the legacy of our own foreign policy mistakes, they're not very good.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to go off of with that. And
I'll tell you one thing, just quickly, as you want to. When I was in Iran, I was interviewed on a TV interview one day, and the interviewer said, "Mr. Brumberg, what do you think? What do Americans think of Khomeini?" And I just didn't know what to say. If I say the wrong thing, do I get to go home? I mean, what's going on here? So I said the only thing I could say is said, Americans don't get up every morning thinking about Khomeini. But what was going through my mind is a lot of Iranians get up every day thinking about the United States. The obsession with U.S. power, the fear of it, is not only something that's typical among many hardliners, but beyond that as well. The revolution was built on a repudiation of American power. So that runs very deep. And when I was asked, what do Americans think? What I was thinking was, boy, are you projecting your own obsessions onto us, right? You think we wake up every morning and worry about Iran. You get up every morning and you worry about the United States. It's a different thing.
I think you talked about this yesterday as well, on the idea that the United States is not always seen as a reform, or is not always seen as a welcome reforming power in many of these places. Someone asked a question asking about what the U.S. State Department or what USAID could have done differently for democratic reforms in Tunisia. And I think there's an idea, this idea of other countries, the United States being interested in spreading democracy in other places, and other countries looking at that even with a critical lens of the United States' own democratic values at the moment. One thing we've seen across the world is this idea of democratic backsliding in Turkey, as we talked about, Brazil, India. Tunisia, right, fell sort of into that camp. Do you think there's hope for countries to recover from this democratic backsliding, like how we saw in Poland last year? Or is authoritarianism sort of this I don't know, not inevitable, but is there a sense of this broad populistic movement across the world with democratic backsliding?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Democratic backsliding has many drivers. For the most part, they're internal and domestic. They're not global. There's a lot of attention now given to, and I'm writing a long essay on this issue, the role of China and Russia and the perception that their collaboration is a major driver of backsliding. I doubt that. At least that's what I'm writing. So that's one question. The other question is, are we talking about backsliding? Or are we talking about erosion, which is hard to undo, right? If you have a beach that's eroded, what are you going to do, right? The house is going to fall in the water. But if you talk about a move from democracy to what's called electoral autocracy, in which you have an institutionalized party that uses the ballot to permanently impose its views on the other, it's very hard to step back from. We thought that Poland was an example of the emergence of electoral autocracy, but what we see is that the backsliding was reversible. So they're not the same things. Mm-hmm. They're not. These are words that have meaning. They have distinctions. So one question, is there a threshold beyond which you've done so much backsliding that you move into a new kind of arena? We're worried about that in the United States with what increasingly we talk about the possibility of the tyranny of the minority, right? There's a new book out on that subject. And so when you have that kind of circumstance, when the ruling party has such control over the judiciary and the parliament and the presidency, even the military, hard to step away from that. But it is true that in many cases the door is still open. We've seen that in Brazil, for example, which got very close to a coup d'etat. It now looks like Bolsonaro is an issue that's back in the press literally in the last week. The thing that limits the U.S. capacity for promoting democracy, it's something I've worked on for years with democracy promoters, is not only the lack of leverage we have over local players and the inability to really rearrange the political arena in a fundamental way. We are ourselves, U.S., major supporters of autocracies, particularly in the Middle East. So there's a deep inconsistency in that regard. Almost every autocracy in the region depends on its military and political and economic relationship with the U.S. So it's hard to make the NATO argument, right? We make a legitimate argument about Ukraine and confronting Putin and his invasion, yet at the same time we have these other relationships. So there's a kind of hypocrisy to that. And then in the Middle East, the continuation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Gaza conflict in particular, has really, in the last 6 months, eroded America's image, the perception that the U.S. is serious about the values it promotes, in a way that may have done even permanent damage to our ability to stand up there as a voice for global freedom. And that seems to be a lasting. I'm not sure if we can pull ourselves out of the catastrophe that, in some sense, the U.S. has helped to encourage. And I'm not saying that in order in any way to deny the right of Israel, where I have relatives, to defend itself or to deal with what was an atrocity and the massacre of more than 1,000 innocent people. But the amount of violence that has been used in retribution in going after Hamas, the death toll of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure, it's astronomical. 30,000 people. And the U.S. is seen as abetting that. And I think the Biden administration is trying to find ways now to climb out of a hole that it somehow put itself into. And it doesn't quite know how. And with elections coming up, it's hesitant to do so. So there are perceptions of American power, consistency versus inconsistency, are very significant. It doesn't mean that other superpowers aren't equally inconsistent. They are. Maybe that's the goes with the turf of being a superpower. But the U.S. legitimacy as a voice for democracy change has been considerably eroded, especially in the last year or so, 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to that a little more, could you say, like, what are some things that you see as like potential opportunities, for the U.S. to improve that relationship?
Well, there's the high politics of the U.S. and security interests that are always there. The contradiction between our advocacy of democracy and our advocacy of security comes with the turf of being a superpower. Mm-hmm. It'll never be resolved. I'm a neo-realist, neoliberal realist. I don't go as far as Mearsheimer, my former professor. But there's no doubt about it that that's a built-in contradiction. Mm-hmm. But it's also one that creates opportunities, because there are a whole slate of U.S. institutions and NGOs that operate on the ground in these countries, and they represent voices that do not carry out U.S. foreign policy from above. And many players on the ground realize this. They understand the constraints and the realities. And those voices are still very important. The National Democratic Institute, which is part of the Democratic Party, the International Republican Institute, Freedom House. I mean, there's a huge ecology of human rights organizations which your tax money pays for legitimately. Mm-hmm. And they are important. Mm-hmm. And what they advocate and what they attempt to do often runs counter to U.S. foreign policy. And under conditions of crisis like the ones we're having now, even more so. But it's not, if it's a built-in contradiction, it's also a built-in opportunity, right? To sort of try to leverage our influence through different institutions and speak up on behalf of democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy, with which I've worked for many years, is a great example. They were advocating the involvement of Islamists in politics in the Arab world before anybody else in Washington was out there doing that. Carl Gershman, who I've known for years, who was the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, deserves a lot of credit for going out on a limb to get parties like Ennahda involved in U.S. democracy efforts, and often against the perspective of a lot of people in Congress. So Carl Gershman is an example, a great one, but there are many others, of American democracy leaders who really were able to push back against the high policy of U.S. diplomacy and take risks. And that still is very much there. And it's going to remain there. But there will be these moments of crisis, Gaza is an example, in which those contradictions come to haunt us and we pay a higher price. But the longer-term opening is there to reassert that kind of influence. And we have a new generation of democracy advocates. Many of them are, I have to say, a graduate of RMA program. I'm giving it a bit of a plug at Georgetown University, who are trained in this field and, who go out there and make a difference. And they're dedicated. They don't get paid enough for what they do, but they do it. So there are these amazing opportunities, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And I encourage our own students and others to consider this career. I'll give you one concrete example. Security sector reform, how to work with militaries and police. It's very important. It doesn't mean we're going to dislodge them from politics, but the relationships themselves count. They count. So there's a lot to be done. What's good about the kind of somewhat chaotic way that U.S. foreign policy is organized is there are many doors. Some of the doors are bigger than others, obviously, more powerful. But there are enough doors to make a difference even when the high policy of the U.S. is very much inconsistent or hypocritical, dominated by support for Democrats and democracies in one region and autocracies in another. That's just a reality that's not going to go away for a long time, if ever.
Right. I think we might start wrapping up now. But one thing just related to what you're talking about is related for students. If there was a paper or book that you would recommend to either young public policy or young democracy and governance students to read, what would you pick, related to these topics or not? What's something that you think that every policy student should read?
book or paper.
Something, yeah. Movie. People have said movies, a documentary, anything that you think is like a fundamental piece that a student should really have in their belt, in their toolkit.
Well, there's an essay. First of all, Journal of Democracy. I'm on the editorial board. Okay, I'm plugging it.
Yeah, go for yeah.
But
Self-plug.
the Journal of Democracy is the leading journal on democratic change and autocracy anywhere. It's done a great job in the Arab world. I wish it would do better on Iran, but overall, it's the go-to place for anything that you want to follow on issues of democratic change and the reassertion of autocracy. So that's definitely one place I'd look. There's an article by Philip Schmitter and Carl Lynn Terry called What Democracy Is and Is Not. That is, I think, a go-to article to think about both what autocracy is and what democracy is. So that's one place I would definitely look to. And, of course, there's increasingly a lot of literature on democratic crisis in the United States. The book I alluded to a moment ago called Tyranny of the Minority. Oh, God, I'm missing out on the names of the authors from Harvard. They're all over the place.
I can look it up.
Yeah. Tyranny of the Minority.
Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat.
Right. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I've only met one of these authors momentarily, but I very much admire their work because they recognize that they recognize that democracy itself can create conditions under which autocracy emerges through the electoral system as opposed to against it. And they recognize in this work and in a previous book, they recognize that, and they emphasize the way in which basic democratic norms require everybody to agree that those who lose elections will respect the right of those who win elections to rule. But those who win elections will also not use the ballot to deprive the opposition of their basic rights. And when this compact, right, this bargain, as Dahl called it, the democratic bargain breaks down, you can't have democracy. The breakdown of that compact in the United States is what we're living through now. And the belief on both sides of this polarized community that the other wants to shut it out. But that fear is particularly potent among the supporters of Trump, who really fear their political exclusion and therefore have stopped believing that they can accept an outcome in which they lose. And that's why many of these people storm the Capitol, not only because they believe that in the conspiracy theory that the election was stolen, which was, of course, nonsense, but because they fear that they can't afford to lose. And I think, so that work is important. And, by the way, a lot of that work can be found in short order form in the Journal of Democracy. So if you don't have time for the book, who has time for books these days, right? You read the article.
Students,
it's all there.
Yeah, well,
Students.
yeah.
By the way, professors, too. We don't have much time.
Right.
So the Journal of Democracy provides a lot of that work at how and what ways electoral institutions are turned into a weapon of political exclusion. And that's a crisis that's pertinent to many democracies, including, of course, the U.S. We'll see how things work out in the coming months.
And ending on a positive note, what's something that you wish more people knew about Tunisia?
Oh, back to Tunisia. Well, like I said during my presentation yesterday, the tragedy is it's full of extraordinary people. I mean, there's a lot of these countries that are in such deep trouble have amazing people, resources, imagination, energy, and you sense this among a new class of political or potential political leaders in Tunisia that if given the chance and the opportunity, and if they weren't tempted by emigration, right, big problem. Brain drain is a huge issue. But that they could step up to the plate and perhaps start succeeding where the previous class failed for the most part. And I've seen these people, and they're quite remarkable. And they're not just from the so-called secular groups, too. They're from disillusioned young members of Ennahda who really fault the leadership for really making a whole set of tactical and strategic mistakes, and they're trying to rethink. So there's a lot of rethinking going on. But rethinking has to come with power distribution and concrete changes. That's what's lacking. But in the meantime, there's just I think there are a lot of people out there, young people. And by young, I mean anything from 20 to 59, who have, enormous imagination and energy and are willing, given the opportunity, to change things around. But it's going to take a good decade, as I said during my talk, before we might get Tunisia back on the track towards some sort of national reconciliation and a reopening of some sort of pluralist democracy.
Finally, this is something we ask every guest on Root of Conflict. What is something that you wish we would have asked you? This is your place to talk about something something you wish we would have asked you, and then talk about it.
Something I wish you would have. You asked me so many questions already. I mean, I suppose that one thing that that is interesting about somebody like myself is sort of how personal background plays a role. And I mentioned the Arab-Israeli dispute and so on, but the bigger question is sort of my family background. My father was a survivor of the Holocaust, left Poland with his parents on September 4th, 1939. Wow. Nearly was killed in the process, and I mean nearly by a few feet, right? And then went to Lithuania, saved by a Japanese diplomat named Sugihara, who gave, so the Sugihara's list, you'll find my family there. There's literally a list, right? There isn't a movie, but there is a list. And so the perspective of, what's interesting about a lot of foreign policy people in the United States is they come from generations of emigres whose experiences molded their understanding not only of international politics, but their place in U.S. foreign policy. My father was a prominent Sovietologist named Abraham Brumberg, who was known in his field in his day, and that's sort of what led him to that field, right? And you just got, the Kissingers, you've got the Brzezinskis. There's just a lot of these folks who sort of came from the old world to the new world, took that experience, and took from that experience and derived from that experience insights and motivation and energy to try to craft a U.S. perspective on the world. I think that's very interesting, and how that sort of background has helped to mold the perspectives of U.S. policy actors is fascinating. It's less obvious now because we have the professionalization of foreign policy, which isn't a very romantic process. And that's taken some of the soul out of it. But you still have this legacy of folks who, and that's true for me too. My perspective is somebody who, this is the son of survivors and refugees who came here looking for a place to survive in and made careers and succeeded. And now we have a situation in the U.S. where we have a political party, the Republican Party, which is been essentially taken over by right-wing nationalists, and you feel that what you think your family escaped, in some respects, is being replicated here. I don't want to exaggerate. I'm not suggesting anything like that, but the capacity of populist authoritarian leaders to undermine democracy and to push nationalist agendas is not something that I think my late father would have thought about when they came to the United States and when he made this his home. And so you really do appreciate, when you have that background, what is the opportunity in the U.S., but also what we could lose. And that's not something you want to forget.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Professor Daniel Brumberg. This episode was produced and edited by Hannah Balikci and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Joshilyn Binkley and Hannah Balikci. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of the series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit their website, thepearsoninstitute.org, and follow them on Twitter at PearsonInst. Inst is spelled INST. Thank you.